March 6, 1944. 29,000 feet above Berlin. Hauptmann Hans Joachim Jobs, veteran of 50 combat missions and holder of the Knight's Cross, stared through the armored glass canopy of his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 at something that violated every assumption he held about aerial warfare. An American fighter, sleek in silver, was keeping pace with his formation at 29,000 feet, 450 miles deep into Germany, 8 months after leaving England. It wasn't supposed to exist. American fighters had range measured in hundreds of miles, not thousands. They escorted bombers to the German border, then turned back, leaving the heavy bombers to face the Luftwaffe alone over the Reich's industrial heartland. This had been the fundamental reality of the air war since 1942. Geography itself protected Germany's core. American bombers could reach Berlin, but American fighters could not. The Silver Fighter keeping station with the bomber formation above Berlin proved that reality had just ended. Jobs's wingman, Lieutenant Karl Schnorrer, transmitted on the squadron frequency, "What is that? It has the range of a bomber but flies like a fighter. How is this possible?" Nobody answered. Nobody knew. The intelligence briefings had mentioned a new American fighter, designated P-51, but the reported specifications seemed like propaganda. A single-engine fighter with range exceeding 1,000 miles? Impossible. A fighter that could match the Bf 109's performance at altitude while carrying enough fuel to escort bombers to Berlin and back? Physically impossible given the laws of aerodynamics and fuel consumption they understood. Yet there it was. Multiple contacts, staying with the bomber stream, positioned perfectly to intercept any Luftwaffe attack. The mathematics that had protected Germany's industrial capacity for 2 years had just been recalculated, and the new equation spelled inevitable defeat. What Hauptmann Jobs couldn't know, what German intelligence hadn't grasped, was that the Silver Fighter above Berlin represented more than technological advancement. It represented the complete transformation of aerial warfare. The fusion of British aerodynamic brilliance with American industrial capacity. The weapon that would break the Luftwaffe's back, not through superior firepower or armor, but through the simple, crushing reality of being everywhere, always, at altitudes where German fighters struggled and ranges German fighters couldn't reach. The P-51 Mustang hadn't just extended the range of fighter escorts, it had eliminated geography as Germany's defense. There was nowhere left to hide, no target beyond reach, no sanctuary where bombers flew unescorted. The Luftwaffe's entire defensive strategy, built around exploiting American fighters' limited range, had become obsolete in the time it took a Silver Fighter to cross the German border. This is the story of the fighter that German pilots couldn't believe was real, the aircraft that rewrote the rules of air combat, the weapon that transformed the daylight bombing campaign from a costly stalemate into inevitable German defeat. And most remarkably, it began as a fighter the U.S. Army Air Forces didn't want, built for a foreign customer, powered by a British engine, and rushed into combat with modifications that nearly everyone predicted would fail. The German pilots who first encountered the P-51 over Berlin in March 1944 were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would kill more Luftwaffe pilots than any other aircraft in history. But the path from rejected prototype to war-winning fighter had been anything but inevitable. October 1940, Inglewood, California. North American Aviation's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, received specifications from the British Purchasing Commission for a new fighter aircraft. Britain, standing alone against Germany after the fall of France, desperately needed fighters. American manufacturers were already producing aircraft under license, but the British wanted something better than existing designs. The specifications were demanding: 400 miles per hour top speed, 1,000-mile range, heavy armament, and delivery within 120 days of contract signature. No American manufacturer believed the timeline was achievable. North American Aviation, which had never designed a fighter aircraft, told the British they could do it. The confidence was either remarkable arrogance or extraordinary vision. North American had built training aircraft and medium bombers, but never a high-performance fighter. Edgar Schmude, a German immigrant engineer, believed that starting from scratch offered advantages over modifying existing designs. They could incorporate lessons learned from 2 years of European air combat without being constrained by legacy decisions. Schmude's design team worked 18-hour days for 102 days. They created a revolutionary airframe featuring a laminar flow wing designed to minimize drag, an engine air intake mounted below the fuselage to optimize airflow, and an internal structure using fewer parts than conventional fighters, simplifying production. The design was designated NA-73X. The prototype first flew on October 26, 1940, 102 days after the design contract was signed. It was one of the most rapid aircraft development programs in aviation history. Test pilot Vance Breeze reported that the aircraft handled beautifully, was faster than expected, and climbed well. There was one significant problem. The Allison V1710 engine, while powerful at low altitude, lost significant performance above 15,000 feet due to its single-stage supercharger. The British, desperate for fighters, ordered the aircraft anyway. They designated it Mustang Mark I. The first operational Mustangs entered RAF service in April 1942, assigned to tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles, where their low-altitude performance, long range, and heavy armament proved valuable. But for high-altitude bomber escort, where performance above 25,000 feet mattered most, the Mustang was inadequate. The U.S. Army Air Forces evaluated the Mustang and reached the same conclusion: excellent aircraft at low altitude, mediocre at high altitude. They ordered limited numbers for ground attack but showed little interest in the design for their primary mission, escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany. The Mustang might have remained a footnote in aviation history. This capable low-altitude fighter couldn't operate where the war was being fought, except for a suggestion from an RAF test pilot that would change everything. April 1942, Rolls-Royce Test Facility, Hucknall, England. Wing Commander Ian Campbell Ord flew a captured Mustang Mark I and immediately recognized its potential. The airframe was exceptional, featuring low drag, excellent handling, and a stable gun platform. Only the engine limited its performance. Campbell Ord wrote a report suggesting that mating the Mustang airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin 61 engine, featuring a 2-stage supercharger optimized for high altitude, could produce the best fighter in the war. The suggestion seemed logical on paper, but involved significant engineering challenges. The Merlin was heavier than the Allison, positioned differently in the airframe, required different cooling systems, and used a different propeller. Essentially, it meant redesigning the forward section of the aircraft while maintaining the exceptional aerodynamics of the original. Rolls-Royce converted 5 Mustangs to Merlin power in late 1942 as an experimental project. The first Merlin-powered Mustang flew on October 13, 1942. The test pilot climbed to 20,000 feet, then 25,000 feet, then 30,000 feet. The aircraft accelerated effortlessly at altitudes where the Allison-powered version had struggled. At 30,000 feet, the Merlin Mustang was 50 miles per hour faster than the Allison version at the same altitude. More significantly, the aircraft's range hadn't diminished. The Merlin consumed slightly more fuel but produced far more power. With external drop tanks, the aircraft could fly for over 4 hours at combat power settings. That translated to a combat radius exceeding 600 miles, enough to escort bombers to targets deep in Germany and return to England. The test results reached the U.S. Army Air Forces in November 1942. The timing was critical. The 8th Air Force had begun daylight bombing operations over occupied Europe in August 1942. The results were sobering. Bombers attacking targets beyond fighter escort range suffered catastrophic losses. On August 17, 1943, raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost 60 B-17s destroyed and 138 damaged from a force of 376 bombers. The loss rate exceeded 15%, unsustainable for continued operations. The fundamental problem was range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter in Europe, had excellent performance and firepower but limited range. Even with external tanks, P-47s could escort bombers only to the German border. The Luftwaffe, understanding this limitation, positioned its fighters beyond the range of American escorts and attacked bombers mercilessly once they were alone. The Merlin Mustang offered a solution. In December 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces authorized North American Aviation to produce a Merlin-powered version, designated P-51B. Packard Motor Company would build Merlin engines under license in the United States, ensuring adequate supply. The first production P-51B flew on May 5, 1943. But getting a revolutionary fighter from prototype to combat-ready production aircraft involved more than just mounting a different engine. Every system had to be tested, every performance characteristic documented, every potential failure mode identified. Pilots had to be trained on the new aircraft. Maintenance crews had to learn different procedures. Supply chains had to be established for spare parts and specialized tools. The process took months. The first P-51Bs reached England in November 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots, experienced in P-47s and P-38s, approached the new fighter with skepticism. It looked fast, but so did many aircraft that proved disappointing in combat. Major James Howard, commander of the 354th's operations, flew the P-51B for the first time on November 11, 1943. His post-flight assessment, recorded in his logbook, captured the transformation. Climbed to 25,000 feet in 8 minutes. Aircraft handles like a dream. Light on controls. Responsive. No bad habits. Range with drop tanks should exceed 1,200 miles. This aircraft will change everything. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission in the P-51B on December 1, 1943, escorting B-17s to targets in France. The mission was routine, no enemy contact, but it validated basic operations. The real test would come when Mustangs encountered the Luftwaffe over Germany. That encounter came sooner than anyone expected. December 13, 1943. The 354th Fighter Group escorted bombers attacking Kiel, Germany, deep enough that previous escorts had to turn back. For the first time, American fighters accompanied the bombers throughout the mission. The Luftwaffe fighters, accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers over Germany, found themselves facing unfamiliar silver fighters at 28,000 feet, 400 miles from England. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, leading a staffel of Bf-109G6s from JG-26, radioed headquarters, American fighters at altitude over target, engaging. His formation climbed to attack. The P-51s turned to meet them. What followed shocked the German pilots. The Mustangs could turn with the Bf-109s at altitude. They could climb as fast. Their dive performance was exceptional, and their firepower, 6.5 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total, created the devastating convergence patterns American fighters were known for. But most disturbingly, the American fighters showed no signs of fuel exhaustion. They fought aggressively throughout the engagement, then stayed with the bombers all the way back to England. The test results reached the U.S. Army Air Forces in November 1942. The timing was critical. The 8th Air Force had begun daylight bombing operations over occupied Europe in August 1942. The results were sobering. Bombers attacking targets beyond fighter escort range suffered catastrophic losses. On August 17, 1943, raids on Schweinfurt and Regensburg cost 60 B-17s destroyed and 138 damaged from a force of 376 bombers. The loss rate exceeded 15%, unsustainable for continued operations. The fundamental problem was range. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, the primary American fighter in Europe, had excellent performance and firepower but limited range. Even with external tanks, P-47s could escort bombers only to the German border. The Luftwaffe, understanding this limitation, positioned its fighters beyond the range of American escorts and attacked bombers mercilessly once they were alone. The Merlin Mustang offered a solution. In December 1942, the U.S. Army Air Forces authorized North American Aviation to produce a Merlin-powered version, designated P-51B. Packard Motor Company would build Merlin engines under license in the United States, ensuring adequate supply. The first production P-51B flew on May 5, 1943. But getting a revolutionary fighter from prototype to combat-ready production aircraft involved more than just mounting a different engine. Every system had to be tested, every performance characteristic documented, every potential failure mode identified. Pilots had to be trained on the new aircraft. Maintenance crews had to learn different procedures. Supply chains had to be established for spare parts and specialized tools. The process took months. The first P-51Bs reached England in November 1943, assigned to the 354th Fighter Group. The pilots, experienced in P-47s and P-38s, approached the new fighter with skepticism. It looked fast, but so did many aircraft that proved disappointing in combat. Major James Howard, commander of the 354th's operations, flew the P-51B for the first time on November 11, 1943. His post-flight assessment recorded in his logbook captured the transformation. Climbed to 25,000 feet in 8 minutes, aircraft handles like a dream, light on controls, responsive, no bad habits. Range with drop tanks should exceed 1,200 miles. This aircraft will change everything. The 354th Fighter Group flew its first combat mission in the P-51B on December 1, 1943, escorting B-17s to targets in France. The mission was routine, no enemy contact, but it validated basic operations. The real test would come when Mustangs encountered the Luftwaffe over Germany. That encounter came sooner than anyone expected. December 13, 1943, the 354th Fighter Group escorted bombers attacking Kiel, Germany, deep enough that previous escorts had to turn back. For the first time, American fighters accompanied the bombers throughout the mission. Luftwaffe fighters, accustomed to attacking unescorted bombers over Germany, found themselves facing unfamiliar silver fighters at 28,000 feet, 400 miles from England. Hauptmann Johannes Naumann, leading a Staffel of Bf 109 G6s from JG-26, radioed headquarters, American fighters at altitude over target, engaging. His formation climbed to attack. The P-51s turned to meet them. What followed shocked the German pilots. The Mustangs could turn with the Bf 109s at altitude. They could climb as fast. Their dive performance was exceptional, and their firepower, 6.5 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total, created the devastating convergence patterns American fighters were known for. But most disturbingly, the American fighters showed no signs of fuel exhaustion. They fought aggressively throughout the engagement, then stayed with the bombers all the way back to England. Naumann's after-action report, captured after the war, documented the German confusion. Encountered new American fighter type over target, performance superior to our aircraft at altitude. Most concerning is range. These fighters escorted bombers' entire mission, over 800 kilometers deep into Germany. This capability fundamentally alters the strategic situation. No target in Germany is beyond range of escorted daylight bombing. Luftwaffe intelligence initially dismissed the reports. A single-engine fighter with range to Berlin was aerodynamically impossible. The fuel required would make the aircraft too heavy to fight effectively. The American fighters observed over Kiel must have been long-range P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine fighters with known range capability, misidentified in combat conditions. But reports continued. On December 20th, P-51s escorted bombers to Bremen. On January 5, 1944, they reached Kiel again. On January 11th, they flew to Oschersleben, 350 miles into Germany. In every mission, the Silver American fighters appeared deeper inside Germany, staying with bombers throughout, fighting effectively at altitudes where German fighters operated. The Luftwaffe intelligence revised its assessment. The new American fighter, definitely a single-engine design, was designated Mustang by the Allies. Estimated performance, maximum speed 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, service ceiling 42,000 feet, range with external tanks approximately 1,200 miles. The specifications seemed exaggerated, but combat evidence supported them. Major Günter Rall, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces with 275 victories, encountered P-51s for the first time on January 24, 1944, during a bomber interception near Frankfurt. His memoir, published in 1980, described the engagement. "I saw them at a distance, silver aircraft that I assumed were P-47s preparing to turn back. We positioned ourselves to attack the bombers after the escorts departed. Then the silver fighters turned toward us. They didn't turn back, they stayed, and they climbed to meet our attack. The engagement lasted perhaps 3 minutes. My wingman was shot down on the first pass. I got one good deflection shot at a Mustang, saw strikes on the wing, but the aircraft rolled away and dove with speed that I couldn't match. I tried to follow, but my aircraft shook violently, approaching compressibility. The Mustang disappeared below, still under control. When I climbed back to altitude, the American fighters were reforming with the bombers. They hadn't left, they weren't leaving. The mission continued with fighters in attendance all the way to the target and return. Afterwards, I told my squadron, this changes the war. We cannot attack bombers unescorted anymore. The Americans have achieved what we thought impossible. They have long-range fighters with performance equal to ours. From this moment, we fight at a disadvantage." The Luftwaffe's defensive strategy had been based on a calculated risk. They knew they couldn't stop American bombers from reaching Germany, but they could attack them when fighter escorts turned back, inflicting losses severe enough to make continued operations untenable. The strategy had worked. Loss rates on unescorted missions exceeded 10%, high enough to threaten the entire daylight bombing campaign. The P-51 eliminated the unescorted phase. Suddenly, every mission into Germany faced fighter opposition from takeoff to landing. The Luftwaffe could still attack, but now they had to fight through American escorts first. The loss ratios reversed dramatically. In December 1943, before P-51s arrived in numbers, the 8th Air Force lost 206 bombers in combat. In January 1944, with P-51s providing deep escort, losses dropped to 166 despite increased mission frequency. More significantly, Luftwaffe losses increased. In December 1943, the 8th Air Force claimed 235 German fighters destroyed. In January 1944, claims rose to 384. The numbers were overclaimed, as combat claims always were, but the trend was clear. The Luftwaffe was losing fighters and pilots at an accelerating rate. The arrival of P-51s in numbers through early 1944 transformed the strategic bombing campaign. In February 1944, the 8th Air Force launched Big Week, a sustained campaign against German aircraft production facilities. Over 6 days, American bombers hit targets across Germany with continuous P-51 escort. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend their aircraft factories, committed their fighters in large-scale battles. The results were catastrophic for Germany. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 355 pilots killed, wounded, or captured during Big Week, plus 500 more aircraft destroyed on the ground or written off due to damage. American losses were significant: 226 bombers and 28 fighters destroyed, but replaceable. German losses, particularly of experienced pilots, were not. General Major Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter arm, understood the strategic implications immediately. In a February 1944 report to Göring, later captured by Allied forces, Galland wrote, "The appearance of American long-range fighters over Germany has made our defensive situation untenable. We can no longer concentrate our forces against unescorted bomber formations. We must fight through fighter screens to reach our targets, suffering losses that exceed our replacement capacity. The Mustang is faster than our fighters at all altitudes above 20,000 feet. It turns as well as our lightest fighters. It can dive away from any engagement with impunity. Most critically, it is always present. There is no phase of bomber operations where we can attack without facing fighter opposition. We are losing the battle of attrition." But statistics and strategic assessments don't capture the psychological impact on German pilots. They had entered the war confident in their training, their aircraft, and their tactics. For 2 years, they had fought with the advantage. Now they faced an opponent who could match them technically and exceed them numerically, who could appear anywhere and stay as long as necessary. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke, a Bf-109 pilot with JG-11, described the demoralization in his diary published posthumously as "I flew for the Führer." March 3, 1944. Mission to intercept bombers attacking Berlin. We climbed to 28,000 feet. The bombers came with their silver fighter escorts, Mustangs, always Mustangs now. We tried to attack. They turned to engage. Oberleutnant Weber was shot down immediately. Feldwebel Gutz disappeared in a dive, perhaps hit, perhaps running. I fired at a B-17 from long range, scored no hits, and broke away as Mustangs turned toward me. We landed with nothing to show, no victories, 2 pilots lost. The mission was typical. Most missions now are typical. We climb, we see bombers with escorts, we engage or we don't, we land, having achieved nothing except survival. The Americans are winning simply by existing. Their fighters prevent us from attacking bombers effectively. We shoot down bombers occasionally, fighters occasionally, but never enough. Never enough. The combat loss ratios tell the story more clearly than words. In the first quarter of 1944, before P-51s became the primary escort fighter, the 8th Air Force lost 9.2 bombers per 1,000 sorties flown, with fighter losses at 2.4 per 1,000 sorties. In the second quarter of 1944, with P-51s escorting most missions, bomber losses dropped to 5.1 per 1,000 sorties, while fighter losses fell to 1.6 per 1,000 sorties. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe losses increased dramatically. Estimated German fighter losses rose from approximately 2,000 aircraft in the first quarter of 1944 to over 2,400 in the second quarter, with pilot casualties exceeding 1,000 killed or captured per quarter. The mathematics were brutal and unavoidable. The Luftwaffe was losing fighters faster than they could be replaced, and pilots far faster than replacement training could produce them. The average experience level of Luftwaffe fighter pilots declined steadily through 1944. In January, the average fighter pilot had approximately 150 hours of combat experience. By June, that figure had dropped to less than 50 hours in combat. American pilots, by contrast, arrived in Europe with 400-plus hours of total flight time and extensive combat training. When the experienced German pilots who had survived since 1939 were killed or captured, their replacements were teenagers with minimal training facing veteran American pilots in superior aircraft. The P-51's technical advantages compounded these factors. The aircraft wasn't just equal to German fighters. In most performance parameters at combat altitudes, it was superior. Maximum speed at 25,000 feet, P-51D, 437 miles per hour. Bf-109G6, 386 miles per hour. FW-190A8, 408 miles per hour. Climb rate to 20,000 feet, P-51D, 7.3 minutes. Bf-109G6, 7.0 minutes. FW-190A8, 10.2 minutes. Service ceiling, P-51D, 41,900 feet. Bf-109G6, 39,700 feet. FW-190A8, 37,400 feet. The range difference was particularly devastating. German fighters had endurance measured in hours. Mustangs had endurance measured in missions. A P-51 could escort bombers to Berlin, engage in combat over the target, chase fleeing German fighters for 50 miles, and still return to England with fuel reserves. A Bf-109 scrambling to intercept bombers over Berlin had perhaps 30 minutes of combat time before fuel forced them to disengage. This disparity fundamentally altered combat dynamics. American pilots could afford to be patient, to maneuver for advantage, to break off and reset if an engagement became unfavorable. German pilots had to commit quickly, press attacks even when conditions were poor, and disengage early to preserve fuel for landing. The pressure led to mistakes. Mistakes led to casualties. Major George Preddy, who would become the highest-scoring P-51 ace with 26.83 victories, described the advantage in a July 1944 interview. "The Mustang gives us options. If we're bounced, we can fight or run. If we see an advantageous position, we can maneuver to take it. If we get into trouble, we can dive away and they can't follow. If they dive away, we can chase them down. And we can do all of this knowing we have fuel to get home. They don't have those options. They have to fight where they are, when we force them to, under conditions we choose." The tactical flexibility extended to strategic decisions about air warfare. With P-51s providing assured escort, bomber commanders could attack any target in Germany with acceptable loss rates. Previously untouchable targets like Berlin, Leipzig, and Schweinfurt became regular destinations. The Luftwaffe, forced to defend everywhere, could concentrate nowhere. German pilots developed grudging respect for the Mustang that bordered on fear. Hauptmann Emil Lang, who had achieved 173 victories flying primarily on the Eastern Front, transferred to Defense of the Reich duties in April 1944. He encountered P-51s for the first time during a bomber interception near Munich. His wingman, Lieutenant Georg Schroeder, survived the engagement and recounted Lang's assessment afterward. "The Hauptmann told us, 'The Mustang is everything the Americans promised and we didn't believe. It's fast, maneuverable, well-armed, and it flies forever. But worse than the aircraft is what it represents. It means they can escort bombers anywhere. It means we must fight on their terms. It means we are losing. Lang was shot down and killed by P-51s on September 3, 1944, during a bomber interception. He was 24 years old, one of Germany's most successful aces, and he lasted 5 months fighting in the West. The acceleration of pilot losses through 1944 created a death spiral for the Luftwaffe. Experienced pilots were killed faster than novices could be trained. The novices, thrown into combat with minimal experience, died quickly, preventing them from gaining the experience that might have enabled survival. The average life expectancy of a newly assigned Luftwaffe fighter pilot in late 1944 was approximately 7 combat missions. Against this backdrop of collapsing defense, the P-51 became omnipresent. By June 1944, the 8th Air Force operated 14 fighter groups, 11 equipped with P-51s. The 15th Air Force in Italy operated 7 fighter groups, 5 with P-51s. Together, they could launch missions with over 1,000 Mustangs escorting bombers throughout German airspace. The D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, saw P-51s flying continuous air cover over the beachheads, destroying any Luftwaffe aircraft that approached. German pilots who attempted to reach the invasion beaches described running a gauntlet of American fighters at every altitude. Oberleutnant Josef Priller, commanding JG-26, famously claimed he and his wingmen were the only German fighters to reach the beaches on D-Day, making a single strafing pass before fleeing with their aircraft riddled by defensive fire. Whether literally true or not, the story captured the reality. The Luftwaffe was absent from the most critical battle of the war because P-51s made it impossible for them to operate. Following D-Day, the strategic bombing campaign intensified. Missions that previously launched 300 bombers now launched 1,000. Targets were hit repeatedly until destroyed. German oil production facilities, marshalling yards, and aircraft factories were systematically demolished. The Luftwaffe attempted to defend, but lacked the numbers, the fuel, and increasingly, the will. Pilot morale collapsed through late 1944. Combat diaries and interrogation reports reveal a force that understood it was beaten. Lieutenant Walter Hagana, shot down and captured in August 1944, told interrogators, "We know we cannot win. Every mission we see more American aircraft. Every mission fewer of our comrades return. The new pilots arrive and die within days. The Mustangs are everywhere. They attack us taking off. They attack us landing. They chase us at low altitude where we try to hide. There is no escape. We fight because those are our orders, but we know how this ends." German technical efforts to counter the P-51 focused on speed. If they couldn't match the Mustang's range or numbers, perhaps they could exceed its speed enough to attack bombers and escape before escorts could intercept. This logic led to the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. The Me-262, powered by twin Junkers 004 turbojet engines, could reach 540 miles per hour, 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51. The speed advantage should have made it untouchable. In reality, operational constraints limited its effectiveness. Jet engines of the era were unreliable, requiring overhauls every 10 to 25 hours of operation. Fuel was scarce. Pilot training was inadequate. Most critically, the Me-262 was vulnerable during takeoff and landing when its speed advantage disappeared. P-51 pilots quickly learned to loiter near known Me-262 bases, attacking jets when they were most vulnerable. Major George Preddy shot down a Me-262 on August 5, 1944, catching it during climb-out from an airfield near Strasbourg. His combat report described the engagement. Observed jet aircraft taking off, positioned to intercept. The jet accelerated rapidly but was still climbing when I reached firing position. opened fire at 400 yards, observed strikes on fuselage and left engine. Enemy aircraft rolled inverted and dove into ground, exploding on impact. Flight time for jet from takeoff to impact, approximately 2 minutes. The Me-262's theoretical speed advantage was negated by the P-51's technical flexibility and numerical superiority. German jet pilots lived in fear of the silver fighters that waited for them to be vulnerable. Multiple Me-262 aces were shot down by P-51s during takeoff or landing, their technological advantage irrelevant when caught at low altitude and slow speed. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe existed primarily on paper. Airfields were cratered by bombing. Fuel reserves were exhausted. Aircraft production continued, but planes sat unusable without fuel to fly them or pilots to fly them. The few remaining experienced pilots flew infrequently, conserving their skills for a decisive battle that would never come. The P-51's contribution to victory cannot be measured solely in aircraft shot down. The Mustang's strategic impact was forcing Germany to devote resources to air defense that could have been used elsewhere. Flak guns protecting cities and factories required millions of shells, diverting production from artillery ammunition. Fighter aircraft production demanded aluminum that could have built tanks. Pilot training consumed fuel that the Wehrmacht desperately needed. More fundamentally, the P-51 made the strategic bombing campaign viable. Without long-range escort, daylight precision bombing would have been abandoned as unsustainable. With P-51 escort, American bombers systematically destroyed German oil production, transportation networks, and industrial capacity. By war's end, Germany's economy was in collapse, not from ground combat, but from sustained aerial bombardment enabled by P-51 escorts. The statistics capture the magnitude. Total P-51 production, 15,686 aircraft. P-51s delivered to 8th Air Force, approximately 5,500. Peak operational strength, January 1945, 14 fighter groups, approximately 1,000 aircraft. Combat missions flown by P-51s in Europe, approximately 213,873. German aircraft claimed destroyed by P-51s, 4,950 in air combat, 4,131 on the ground. P-51s lost in combat, 2,520 aircraft. Luftwaffe pilot casualties 1944 to 1945, approximately 13,000 killed, wounded, or captured. German fighter production 1944, 25,285 aircraft. German fighter production January to May 1945, 4,936 aircraft. The numbers tell a story of overwhelming force. The Luftwaffe couldn't replace losses. American production exceeded losses by factors of 5 or 10. German pilots, even the skilled survivors, faced impossible odds. The silver fighters were everywhere, always, at every altitude, escorting every raid. The psychological impact on German civilians was equally devastating. The sight of American bomber formations crossing German skies in broad daylight, unhindered by fighter defenses, demonstrated more clearly than any propaganda that Germany was losing. The Luftwaffe's inability to protect their own cities destroyed morale and faith in victory. In April 1945, with Berlin surrounded and Germany in collapse, the last Luftwaffe fighters flew their final missions. Many were caught on the ground, destroyed by P-51s strafing airfields. Others ran out of fuel attempting to reach Allied bomber formations and crashed attempting emergency landings. A few were shot down in air combat, their inexperienced pilots no match for veteran American pilots with hundreds of hours in Mustangs. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The P-51 Mustang had been in operational service for 17 months. In that time, it had transformed from a fighter the Luftwaffe didn't believe could exist into the weapon that destroyed German air superiority. The journey from rejected prototype to war winner took less than 4 years from first flight to victory. The post-war assessments by German commanders were unanimous in recognizing the P-51's decisive impact. General Major Adolf Galland, in post-war interrogations, stated, "The Mustang was the decisive factor in Allied air superiority, not because it was dramatically superior to our fighters in performance, though it was superior, but because it could escort bombers anywhere in Germany. Once that capability existed, our defensive strategy collapsed. We couldn't mass forces to overwhelm bomber formations because the escorts prevented it. We couldn't attack unescorted formations because there were none. We were forced to fight on American terms at American-chosen times and places against superior numbers. The outcome was inevitable." Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, another high-scoring ace, offered a more personal assessment in his memoir. "The first time I saw Mustangs over Berlin, I knew we had lost. Not the battle, the war. That fighter represented American industrial capacity applied with British aerodynamic knowledge to solve a strategic problem. We had no answer to that combination. We could build better engines or better weapon systems, but we couldn't build 15,000 fighters while sustaining our ground forces. The Americans could. They did. The Mustang proved that, in war, adequate technology in overwhelming numbers defeats superior technology in insufficient numbers." The technical achievement represented by the P-51 is often overshadowed by its combat record, but the engineering accomplishment deserves recognition. North American aviation designed a fighter from blank sheet to first flight in 102 days. They created an airframe so aerodynamically clean that it could carry the fuel load for 1,600-mile range while maintaining performance equal to lightweight interceptors. They integrated a British engine into an American airframe so seamlessly that the combination outperformed either nation's independent efforts. The laminar flow wing that Schmood designed for the P-51 represented advanced aerodynamics that wouldn't become standard in fighter aircraft until jets. The wing profile, with its maximum thickness well aft of the leading edge, delayed the onset of turbulent airflow, reducing drag dramatically. This single design element enabled the P-51's exceptional range and speed. The radiator installation, mounted in a ventral scoop below the fuselage, actually provided thrust through carefully designed ducting that accelerated heated air exiting the radiator. The Meredith effect, as it became known, converted waste heat into forward thrust, partially offsetting the drag of the radiator installation. This innovation allowed the P-51 to retain performance despite the cooling requirements of its powerful engine. The internal fuel capacity increased through innovative packaging, and the addition of a fuselage tank behind the pilot gave the P-51 range that seemed impossible for a single-engine fighter. The original design carried 184 gallons internally. The P-51D carried 269 gallons internally, plus two 110 or 150-gallon external tanks. Total fuel capacity of 569 gallons gave the aircraft its extraordinary range. The weaponry evolved through production variants. Early P-51Bs and Cs carried 4.5 caliber machine guns with 350 rounds per gun. The P-51D, the most numerous variant, carried 6.5 caliber machine guns with 1,880 rounds total. The firepower, while less than the P-47's 8 guns, was adequate for fighter-versus-fighter combat and provided excellent harmonization for shooting at bomber-sized targets. The bubble canopy introduced on the P-51D provided 360-degree visibility, addressing one of the major limitations of earlier variants. Pilots could see behind and above them without blind spots, critical for survival in combat where most losses came from unseen attackers. But all the engineering excellence would have been meaningless without pilots capable of exploiting the aircraft's capabilities. The P-51 pilot training program emphasized energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics that maximized the Mustang's strengths. Captain Donald Gentile, one of the top Mustang aces with 22 aerial victories, described the tactical approach in a training lecture recorded in May 1944. The Mustang fights best at high speed and high altitude. We maintain speed, we maintain altitude, we use our advantages. If bounce from above, we dive away and they can't follow. If they try to run, we chase them down. If they try to climb away, we climb with them and they run out of performance before we do. The key is never fighting their fight. We choose the engagement, we choose the terms, we choose when to break off. That's the advantage the Mustang gives us. The German pilots who survived the war carried memories of the silver fighters that ended their air force. In reunions decades later, former Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the P-51 with respect bordering on awe. At a 1980 reunion in Germany, Oberst Günter Röhl, 275 victories and third highest scoring ace of all time, met Colonel Hub Zemke, P-47 and P-51 ace with 18 victories. Their conversation, recorded on video, captured the perspective. Röhl: "When did you fly the Mustang?" Zemke: "I transitioned in March 1944, took my group to Berlin in April." Röhl: "I was there. I saw you. Silver aircraft everywhere, at an altitude we couldn't sustain. We knew then that the war was lost. Not the battle, the war. Your range made everything we planned irrelevant." Zemke: "The Mustang was the right aircraft at the right time. Without it, the bombing campaign might have failed." Röhl: "Without it, you would have failed. With it, we could not succeed. Sometimes war is decided not by bravery or tactics, but by engineering and production. You had both. We had neither in sufficient quantity." The conversation between former enemies, conducted with mutual respect, highlighted a truth often lost in discussions of air combat. Individual courage and skill mattered far less than systemic advantages. The best German pilot in the best German fighter still faced overwhelming odds when outnumbered 10-1 by competent American pilots in adequate aircraft. The P-51 Mustang's legacy extends far beyond World War II. The aircraft remained in service with the U.S. Air Force through the Korean War, where it flew ground attack missions until jet fighters replaced it in 1953. Numerous air forces worldwide operated Mustangs into the 1980s. The aircraft became the symbol of American air power in the same way the Spitfire symbolized British resistance. But the true legacy is what the Mustang represented: the application of engineering excellence and industrial capacity to solve strategic problems. The aircraft existed because British purchasing agents saw a need, American designers saw an opportunity, and both nations' industries collaborated to produce a weapon that exceeded anything either could have built independently. The silver fighter that Hauptmann Jobs saw over Berlin in March 1944, the fighter he couldn't believe was real precisely because nothing about it was impossible. It was simply engineering executed correctly, aerodynamics applied properly, and production scaled adequately. The Germans had dismissed it as impossible because they couldn't imagine doing it themselves. The Americans and British did it anyway. The mathematics that Jobs couldn't accept were simple. A fighter with sufficient fuel capacity and aerodynamic efficiency could escort bombers anywhere. The P-51 Mustang proved those mathematics were correct. In doing so, it ended the Luftwaffe's ability to defend Germany, enabled the destruction of German industry, and demonstrated that control of the air, once established, was decisive. The war in Europe might have been won without the P-51 Mustang, but it would have taken longer, cost more lives, and required different strategies. The Mustang shortened the war, saved lives, and made victory certain rather than probable. When German pilots first met the P-51 over Berlin, they couldn't believe it was real. By war's end, they understood it was the most real thing in the sky. The fighter that couldn't exist had erased them from existence. The silver aircraft that appeared over Berlin in March 1944 had not just extended the range of fighter escorts, it had eliminated distance as Germany's defense, and in doing so, it had ended the war, one impossible fighter at a time.